professora do Instituto de Saúde Coletiva de Public Health é difícil dizer, da Drexel University, Downside. E vem trabalhando com pesquisas na interface entre segregação urbana, saúde pública, raça, racismo. Tem cooperado com alguns pesquisadores brasileiros, uma delas é a professora Verônica Tosti, que fez doutorado aqui na casa. E hoje a Sharrelle vai apresentar algumas discussões, algumas reflexões sobre essas pesquisas, sobretudo na comparação Brasil e Estados Unidos. Eu, como Cicerone, fiquei um pouco na dúvida se propunha uma tradução consecutiva, que costuma ser algo muito chato e faz a palestra durar o dobro do tempo, mas eu achei melhor que a Sharrelle falasse em inglês mesmo, e aí se alguém tiver alguma dúvida, alguma coisa, a gente pode depois conversar. A Sharrelle está super aberta para conversar depois com quem tiver interesse nos dados dela, e enfim, temos vários tradutores simultâneos aqui potenciais. Ok? So, 30 minutes or 40 minutes if you want, and after we open the mic to debate. Okay? Thank you.
That's all I have. Good afternoon. I just want to thank you so much, Luis, for the introduction, for the invitation to be here. Veronica, you're really the orchestrator behind me being here today, so thank you so much. I also want to acknowledge my colleague, Simone Santos, who's a researcher at Fiocruz, and so thank you so much for also being here today. So I'll just go ahead and get started. So I wasn't sure of the crowd, so I'm going to start with maybe some information that is very familiar with this crowd, but I think it's good to set up the context and the perspective that I'm coming from in order to look at this intersection of place, racism, and health from the United States and Brazil. So I am in a room full of social scientists, so I will start with a quote from a sociologist. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. This quote was written by none other than W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois is one of the foremost authorities on race, or was one of the foremost authorities on race in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. And these words were actually found in his 1906 book, The Souls of Black Folks, where he outlined the marginalization that blacks experience in the South and in the United States about 50 years after slavery. And these words are really, really important because they really capture the essence of what it meant to be black in the United States, and also the racial relations that existed at the turn of the 20th century. So when he said that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, what he was talking about were the deep-rooted inequalities that existed for blacks and whites, and acknowledgement that those inequalities were rooted in the deep history of slavery and slavery in the United States. And if we were to understand, at the turn of the 20th century, if we were going to understand race and racism, we had to understand that history and how we got there. But before he said those words, he actually wrote another book called The Philadelphia Negro. Has anyone familiar with the Philadelphia Negro? Raise your hand. No, okay. So Du Bois was ahead of his time. He was, just to give a little background on him, he was the first African American to graduate with a PhD from Harvard. And he conducted one of the most seminal sociological investigations on race in the United States. The work is brilliant. It was actually arguably one of the most seminal pieces of sociology in the United States at the time. And so he was ahead of scholars, not only black, but just in general in the field. And what this piece of work did, the Philadelphia Negro, he combined data that was publicly available, so data on vital statistics, data from the census, and other secondary data sources, with data that he went and collected door to door using surveys and semi-structured interviews, right? So just imagine doing this work in 1899 without cell phones, without computers, without laptops, just going door to door to investigate what it meant to be black in a city in the United States. And so when he said those words, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, he was doing that from a space deeply rooted in investigation and deeply rooted in empirical data that he had collected just 7 years prior in the city of Philadelphia. His goal for this work was very simple. He said the design of the work is to lay before the public such a body of information as may be a safe guide for all efforts towards the solution of the many Negro problems of a great American city. So the work that he was doing as a sociologist was to, in fact, inform the public about the plight of blacks and think about what needed to be done in order to move forward to bring about racial inequality in the United States. So why is this important for me, and why has he become such an influence in my work? Well, before Google Maps, he created maps of the city of Philadelphia, and he actually went around and placed color codes, red, green, and blue, of maps in the city of Philadelphia where he identified poor working class individuals, very poor individuals, as well as middle class blacks. And he documented actually where they lived. So this is just one representation of a map of one of the major thoroughfares in Philadelphia where I currently live. And he showed where blacks were living in the city, and he described in that text the conditions of the blacks in that city. In addition to these maps that he created, he took census data, and these boxes represent what was known as wards or neighborhoods in that time. So in addition to these maps, he also overlaid kind of these wards with data from vital statistics and looked at mortality based on where people lived, based on the ward in which they lived in, excuse me. And he found, this was using data from 1884 to 1890, that blacks living in different neighborhoods had different risk of mortality depending on where they lived and depending on the social conditions in which they found themselves. So the range of mortality, and this is among blacks, range from as high as 48 per 1,000 deaths to 15 or 16 per 1,000 deaths again. And again, this variation for him was a clue that it wasn't just about biological difference per se, but it was the social conditions in which people lived their lives and that really shaped health and shaped risk for mortality. This, I'm sorry? This is he aggregated these data from 1884 to 1890. And so he looked at the death rate in this time period. And this was all publicly available data. So again, in 1889, he was showing that where people lived mattered, and it had huge implications for health and mortality. So Du Bois's work is a springboard for my own research, which looks at this intersection, the intersection of place, race, and now I'm beginning to more so say racism and health. We know, and there's a large body of empirical evidence from the epidemiologic literature, that place matters for health. Where people live dictates various outcomes from infant mortality, adult mortality, to cardiovascular disease risk, et cetera. But we also know that race, and more specifically racism, drives where people live. The residential environments that people live in are very much dictated by race. And different practices, whether they're legal practices or not, dictates where a large majority of marginalized racial groups live. And so this combination, this intersection of place and race, helps us to understand health in marginalized racial populations, and also racial inequalities that exist between marginalized racial populations and other groups. And so this is an important intersection to think about when we're thinking about health, which commonly in epidemiology is thought of out of context. And so it's really important to think about this intersection. So I wanted to back up because I wasn't sure. I wanted us to have a baseline definition of what I mean when I say racism, because sometimes it's a hard term to say. They're like, oh, I'm not racist. But when I talk about racism, I'm talking about a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on race that unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities and advantages others. And this definition, I think, is very important because it removes us from these interpersonal kind of relations between people, which are very important, but gets us to think about the structures, the institutions, and the ways in which society structures itself that disadvantages certain racial marginalized groups. And this definition was actually constructed by an epidemiologist who studies race in the US, Dr. Kamara Jones. And so this is from this vantage point of racism, of institutionalized racism, that I think about the work that I've done in both the United States and now into Brazil. So I put this picture up here. I don't know how many of you all follow media in the US and have followed some of the race discourse and the racism discourse that has happened really in the last 5 years. This was on the cover of Time magazine back in 2015. And it was following some of the unrest that happened just after the shooting death of Mike Brown and the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Mike Brown in Ferguson, where really, it wasn't that we were discovering that these things were happening, or this is a new phenomenon, but we were beginning to document the police brutality that was happening in communities of color, specifically targeting Black men as well as Black women. So these riots happen, right, in Baltimore, in Ferguson, and protests happen. And peaceful demonstrations happen in these communities. And while the focus of, or these demonstrations were a direct reaction to police brutality, what they really were also was a reaction to the systemic racism that had existed in communities of color for decades and decades and decades, right? So so the shootings, the very visible manifestations of racism, killing unarmed Black men, was only one symptom of the broader issues of economic and racial inequality that existed in communities of color and has existed in communities of color for decades. And so what I think this time period, and we're still wrestling with it in the US, was it helped to reinsert this conversation into the public discourse about race, racism, institutionalized racism, and the stark inequalities that exist in many settings, but specifically in urban settings in the United States. That is really important. And so we were reminded, if you will. I mean, it's always existed. Racism has existed, segregation has existed, but these events help to kind of bring those back to the public discourse and the public memory. So what does segregation look like in the United States? Well, you would think, so this year is 2018. In 1968, in the United States, the Civil Rights Act was passed. And a part of the Civil Rights Act included the Fair Housing Act, which was supposed to really get rid of residential segregation in the US. However, it's 50 years, and that bill was signed in April of 1958. But 50 years later, we're still the United States is still a very segregated society. And so this is a map of the 50 largest cities in the United States. And it's a map of the Black-White Dissimilarity Index. Everyone know what the Dissimilarity Index measures? Yes. Can you tell us what the Dissimilarity Index measures? Right. So it's basically, it represents the proportion of Blacks that would have to move in a city in order to create a completely integrated society, or integrated metropolitan area, right? So what you'll notice about this map is most of these blue dots are above 50. So in most large metropolitan areas in the United States, the dissimilarity index is 50, meaning that 50% of the Blacks in that city would have to relocate. And the highest is in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, with a dissimilarity index of 81, meaning that 81% of blacks in Milwaukee would have to move to be able to create a completely integrated society. So there's even 50 years after we had the civil rights movement, think 1968 was when Martin Luther King was assassinated. You get a bunch of civil rights bills that say, okay, we're going to deal with racial segregation, we're going to deal with integration of schools, neighborhoods, et cetera. But 50 years later, nearly 50 years later, you're still seeing these high levels of segregation across many metropolitan areas in the United States. So why would an epidemiologist be concerned about segregation and racism? And that's because I think it's inextricably linked to health. And you can't understand the health of black folks in the United States without understanding this history and the stark inequalities that exist. And so in 2001, a sociologist who happens to also practice in public health now, Dr. David Williams, wrote a seminal paper citing residential segregation as a fundamental cause of racial disparities or racial inequalities. And he talks about several mechanisms that link residential segregation to health. One is that residentially segregated neighborhoods tend to have less economic and educational opportunities. There's also exposure to hazardous neighborhood environments that are not conducive to health, so lack of access to healthy foods, limited access to resources, health care, et cetera. And all of the kind of social ills that come bundled with concentrated disadvantage, right? And so higher rates of violence and crime and other social problems. And so all of that becomes kind of coupled with segregation in the US. So I like to say or tell people that it's not inherently bad for blacks to want to live in the same neighborhood, right? There's nothing bad per se about that separation. What the point is that in the US, and I'll argue that possibly here in Brazil as well, is that that separation comes with the separation of resources, the inequitable distribution of resources and economic opportunity that then creates these environments that are not conducive to health. And so residential segregation becomes one of the physical and the spatial manifestations of deep-rooted inequalities in the in a country, in a society. And I also wanted to bring in work from an epidemiologist that really helps me to kind of think about these very large macro-social phenomena like segregation and linking it to population rates of health and disease. And that perspective is eco-social theory, which was first introduced by Nancy Krieger, who's an epidemiologist at Harvard, one of my former professors. And she basically has this one construct that she identifies as embodiment, and that is how we literally incorporate biologically the material and social world in which we live. Right, so we can't separate, again, the segregation that exists in society, both be it economic and racial, from the manifestations of health and disease that we see in populations. And it's actually the understanding that those things are inextricably linked is crucial to epidemiology. You can't understand health out of context. You have to think about it in context. So that means the context of neighborhoods, but it also means the historical and political context that creates inequitable neighborhoods. And so you have to think about all of these factors as very important drivers of population health and population health disparities. And so I kind of said this before, but these are kind of the exposures that we find often linked to segregated neighborhoods, again, in the US, but also, I would argue, here in Brazil. So access to unhealthy foods, crumbling infrastructure, exposure to pollution, limited access to education and jobs, et cetera, all of which, again, come bundled in these segregated neighborhood environments. So most of my work to date has focused on the United States and focused on a specific area in the United States. I'm a Southern girl from North Carolina, and that's in the southern part of the United States. And so for my dissertation and for a lot of my work since then, I've used a study called the Jackson Heart Study. And the Jackson Heart Study is based in Jackson, Mississippi. Anybody kind of know where Jackson, Mississippi is? Maybe, maybe not. Jackson, Mississippi is in the heart of the South, what we call the Deep South. And it's rooted in the legacy of Jim Crow, of segregation, and has, I mean, it's one of the states that has, in terms of every indicator, whether it's economic, health, or otherwise, is bad, right? And a lot of that can be traced back to the legacy of slavery, the legacy of Jim Crow, the legacy of segregation that exists. And so there, in the heart of the South, in the Deep South, there's a study of about 5,000 individuals, and we've collected data on these individuals since 2000, and followed those individuals up till now. So we're actually getting ready to do a fourth wave of follow-up with these 5,000 individuals. And it's a cohort study, a very traditional epidemiologic cohort study. That was, again, funded by the National Institutes of Health. And one of the nice things about this cohort study is that we've also overlaid the individual level data with census data, and geo-reference each individual within the study to the neighborhood or the census tract in which they live. So for a study that is under review, you know how that goes, we looked at residential segregation and cardiovascular disease. And by cardiovascular disease, I mean heart disease and stroke. And we constructed a measure of residential segregation at the neighborhood level. And then we chose individuals who had no prior history of stroke or heart disease, and followed those individuals from 2000 to 2011. And we wanted to see, if you live in a certain neighborhood, a racially segregated neighborhood, do you have a higher risk of developing heart disease or stroke in those neighborhoods? And in fact, you do. So this is an all African American sample, and these individuals were free of cardiovascular disease when we started following them. And what we find is a twofold difference in the risk of having a heart disease or stroke for individuals living in highly segregated neighborhoods. Again, this is I've controlled here for age and gender. Once we do multivariable models to adjust for socioeconomic status, health behaviors, and neighborhood conditions, we still see this pattern, such there's a higher risk of developing heart disease and stroke in neighborhoods that are highly segregated. One of the fascinating things about this is that this is an all African American sample. So in the US, the debate about health disparities has tended to be very biological. There are biological or genetic differences between Blacks that would suggest that that's why they have higher rates of everything. We literally have higher rates of everything. However, when you do a study among Blacks and show these differences, it's a strong, strong, strong evidence that what really matters is the environment, and what really matters is the segregation. And so this is, like I said, it's under review, and hopefully will be out soon. But again, showing that segregation matters, where people live matters, and it has really strong implications for health of minority populations and disparities. So what about Brazil? Why? So that's why you really wanted me to come here, right? Because the work in the U.S. is like, oh yeah, it's done that. So why Brazil? Why bring this same kind of logic and argument to Brazil? So I have two anecdotes to kind of describe why I became interested in the Brazilian context. So the first one actually occurred 15 years ago when I wasn't even a researcher. I was just a college student who was kind of an activist on campus, really interested in social justice issues, and was invited by a group to come to in 2005 to the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, Brazil. So I was a 20-year-old, had just turned 20. I called my dad. I was like, Dad, I got invited to go to the World Social Forum. He was like, oh, that sounds good. My dad's a social activist as well. He was like, oh, that's a really good opportunity. He was like, where is it going to be? It's going to be in Brazil. Oh, no, you can't go to that. You can't go to Brazil. So I was like, Dad, but it's going to be a really awesome experience. There'll be other, activists, young activists that I can meet and network with. He was like, no. So at first he said, no, you can't go. I'm the oldest, so I get all the no's, right? Now my siblings, they're like, oh yeah, they get to do anything. But at the time, but the next day he called me back, he's like, you can go. So I came, and I was excited because this was going to actually be my first trip abroad. So my first experience out of the United States, and I was like, wow, I get to go to Brazil. So in my mind, I had this, vision of Brazil, Latin American country. Oh yeah, it's like any other Latin American country. It's Latin, and so I get on the plane. We have a layover actually here in Rio, and I remember to this day, step off the plane, and I'm looking around, and I was like, there are black people in Brazil. And I didn't know it from I don't know, no one ever taught me in school. They never taught me about the history of slavery here in this country. And it was a shock to me to see so many individuals that looked like me, that I was like, oh, she could be like a cousin or a sister or, that kind of thing. And so this idea that, so the budding researcher in me began to do some research on the history of slavery, and that just like the United States had a similar history of slavery, and in fact had more slaves imported from West and Central Africa than the United States. And so, like I said, this was a shock to me, and it began my curiosity kind of in the Brazilian context, in the racial context of Brazil, and trying to understand that. So that's not much news to you. So later I found out that in fact in the 2010 census, Brazil's what's considered black and Pardo population was over 50%. Again, having the largest Afro-descendant population outside the continent of Africa. And for a person who studies race and racism is very fascinating to me. So, race is, there's obviously blacks in Brazil, and that race also manifests in racial inequalities, very similar to the US. And so this is data from 2015 that shows the inequality based on income in Brazil. Again, this is not lost on anyone in this room, where blacks and mixed race individuals earn much, much less than whites in Brazil, very similar to the US. And these economic inequalities play out spatially. So I was looking at a map in Louise's office, and Veronica actually sent me this map to show that this is a map of poverty, and it's a dot density map showing where each dot represents poverty or poor person. So the very dark shaded purple areas are areas where the individuals are very poor. The yellow and, very rich, and then the yellow areas are people who are very poor, right? So this is a map of income. But if you look at a map of race, it's almost a mirror image of that, right? So these economic inequalities play out spatially and overlay or really mirror the racial inequalities that exist. And this is just for Rio, but this can be seen in other cities in Brazil. So this, as a social epidemiologist, interested in place, interested in how racism and place and health come together, this fascinated me. But I think the most poignant observation came when I came here back in 2016 and rode the metro. And so in 2016, I was staying in Flamengo in an apartment. And I would take the metro from Flamengo to Fiocruz to do my partnership work. So you take the metro, I would get off at Triagem, and then Triagem to Manguinhos. And I was like, okay, this is okay. So riding on the train, you go out of the south zone, you go into, more northern zone, and the whole landscape shifts, the whole landscape. So you go from, these are pictures I took. You go from, the Bay Area, the nice buildings, you got Cristo looking out for you at the top of the mountain, places to do exercise, yada, yada, yada. You have all these resources available, for individuals. But then you get to Zona Norte, and this is literally outside of the train station, and it's night and day. it's a very different experience, a very different lived experience for the individuals that live in these areas. So for me, this was, and not only did the landscape change, but the demographics changed. And we definitely, I noticed, at least my, kind of anecdotally, where you had higher proportions of whites in the South Zone, but when I got to Manguinhos, it was mostly black and brown. So these inequalities that I literally saw visually just by hopping on a 25-minute train ride gave me clues to the inequalities that exist spatially in Rio, and again, I'm seeing in other places in Brazil. So that's what led me to this work, this idea that you have this history, this legacy of slavery that created this racial hierarchy here in Brazil, similar to the United States, that you have these inequalities based on race, both socioeconomic and otherwise, and those inequalities play out spatially and in cities, and you see this intercity inequality that might have implications for health. So we wrote a thing. Veronica, my colleague Dora at Fiocruz, and a number of authors, many authors, wrote a paper called At the Intersection of Place, Race, and Health, Residential Segregation and Cardiometabolic Risk Factors in the Brazilian Longitudinal Study of Health. And actually this paper came out officially just prior to me coming here on February the 15th in a special issue of Social Science and Medicine on the role of racism in health inequalities. So we're really excited about this paper because it's one of the first large-scale papers to really look at residential segregation and race in relation to health outcomes in the Brazilian context. So I'm going to describe the study a little bit. So here were our research objectives. The first thing we wanted to do was to measure residential segregation at the neighborhood level. And we did this using a novel spatial approach that I'll describe a little bit later. And then once with that measure, we wanted to describe segregation by race in this particular cohort. Then we wanted to empirically examine the association between residential segregation and hypertension and diabetes, two cardiometabolic risk factors that we have found to pattern by residential segregation in other parts of the world, so in the United States and otherwise. And then examine the extent to which these associations differed based on marginalized racial status in Brazil. So we did this using data from the Brazilian Longitudinal Study of Adult Health. It is a large multi-center cohort that was designed back in 2008 to examine the etiology of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. It consists, in 2008, they got information from 15,000 civil servants across 6 urban centers in Brazil. So let's see if I can name them all. Rio de Janeiro, Vitória, Vitória, yeah, sim, Salvador, Bahia, Belo Horizonte, Minas Gerais, Sao Paulo, and Porto Alegre, Rio Sul. So those 6 areas have various samples of civil servants. And they were based on civil servants from research or universities. Research institutions or universities. And the nice thing about the sample is that it's heterogeneous with regard to social class and race. And so we have 16% black in the sample, 28% Pardo, 52% white, and less than 5% of other. So we have a nice mix of blacks, whites, and Pardos in the sample. And as someone who studies place, the other nice thing about it was that these participants have been geo-referenced to the neighborhood in which they lived. And so actually Simone is responsible for quite a bit of the work on geo-referencing the ELSA Brazil sample for each metropolitan area. And then we can overlay that data from the individual to census data from the IBGE. So our first task was to measure residential segregation. And I think of residential segregation as the systematic kind of distribution of different individuals into different neighborhoods. And there's a sociologist, as you can see, I read a lot of sociologists. Massey and Denton, who wrote a seminal piece on American segregation, but they identify one of the dimensions of segregation is the clustering dimension of segregation, such that neighborhoods that are surrounded by similar neighborhoods are identified as segregated. So we took an approach that actually is usually applied in hotspot analysis for disease outbreaks. But we took this approach to apply it to our measure of segregation. So we used the Geddes-Ord local G statistic. And this statistic, I'll show you the equation later, but it basically is a measure of clustering. How clustered are our neighborhoods that have high levels of individuals earning 0 to 3 minimum wages. And again, I said we used study-defined neighborhoods, which were groups of census tracts. And we calculated the score for each individual city, so the 6 different cities in the study. And this is important because there might be important differences between the 6 cities that we have. So here's the equation. It can look frightening, but it's not too bad. So I'll just walk you through what this means. So basically, we have this, which is X bar, which represents a metropolitan's aggregate or mean level proportion of 0 to 3 households with 0 to 3 minimum wages. And then the X sub J, this value here, represents a neighborhood's proportion. So this equation gets at the deviation from the metropolitan level aggregate of the proportion of 0 to 3 minimum wages. So for each metropolitan area, we can calculate this deviation. And then this W suggests that it's a weighted score, meaning that a score will be higher, a neighborhood will be more segregated if it's surrounded by other neighborhoods that have high levels of segregation, right? And so it's basically, essentially, a spatially weighted Z-score that represents, one, the deviation from the metropolitan area, as well as the surrounding areas in the, for a particular neighborhood. So large scores would represent neighborhoods that are highly segregated. Low negative scores would represent neighborhoods that are less segregated. And scores near 0 would represent no spatial clustering or more integration. And this is what it looks like in an example. So this is a map of Belo Horizonte. And this is what I'm told from people from Belo Horizonte is the kind of the center of the city, like the kind of where the center of commerce, et cetera, et cetera. And this would be low segregation, or areas where there's low proportions of individuals with 0 to 3 minimum wages. On the outskirts are where you would have more highly segregated neighborhoods that have high proportions of individuals with 0 to 3 minimum wages and are also surrounded by similarly high neighborhoods. And so we think that's important, not only to be yourself highly segregated, but also surrounded because of lack of resources and what that means for accessing different services of the city. So these areas would be highly segregated here, here, and here, and these areas would be have less proportion in those. And we did this for each six of the sites. Then we wanted to look at what this distribution looks like in the sample, and so we saw that we have pretty much a normally distributed distribution of this particular score in the full sample. And when we look at whites, it seems pretty normally distributed. However, when you begin to look at blacks, you see that it's skewed, such that blacks tend to have higher scores or higher segregation scores compared to whites. And browns are also skewed a little bit better, but not too much. But again, the similar skew of the distribution of the segregation score in our sample. We also just showed these box and whisker plots, and again, blacks having the highest levels of segregation in our sample and compared to whites. And if you look at specific areas, so for example, if you look at Bahia, Salvador, what we see is that there are browns and blacks are a little bit more distinct in Bahia. And so there's this gradient of segregation from black, brown to white. But if you look at us, and we know that Bahia and Salvador is mostly black, right? But if you look at Porto Alegre, which is a majority white population, black and brown are a lot more similar, right? So what our argument, at least what we think, and this is descriptive, we would have to do more data on this, is that oftentimes when I started talking about this in this context, people were like, oh, it's just SES. It's not about race, it's just about SES. But I would argue that this says that there is something racial also happening with segregation, that it is a function of SES, but that's not the only driver that dictates segregation here in Brazil. So again, it's important to think about both the racial and the economic component of segregation in this context. Yes. Oh, okay. So do you understand what this represents? Who's not familiar? Oh, okay. I don't know. Okay. So yeah. So this is just the mean and the interquartile range and the median, basically.
You are obligated.
Yeah, good. That's a good thing. So then we looked at categories, high, medium, and low. And again, see this patterning by race, where blacks are more like about 20, I think that's 22% of the black population lived in segregated neighborhoods, highly segregated neighborhoods, compared to 20% of browns, compared to 7% of whites. Again, this racial distribution of segregation in the population. So then people still said, well, that's just SES. So then we looked at only among university educated individuals. And again, we saw this very similar pattern. So if you just look at people who have a university degree, you still see this patterning of segregation by race, even among individuals who have a university degree, which suggests to me that segregation in the in Brazil is a function both of socioeconomic status and race. And it's actually similar in the US. A lot of the folks living in segregated neighborhoods in the US are poor, but there's also a history of racial exclusion and segregation that is about race, and that is important to think about. So then we get into our main analysis. Again, our outcomes were hypertension and diabetes. We controlled for a number of sociodemographic characteristics, as well as behavioral and neighborhood conditions that we think might mediate associations. And our statistical analysis were regular regression, logistic regression models. And we also had we also did some sensitivity analysis as well. So this is cross-classified categories of residential segregation by race. And we saw some very interesting patterns, not surprising, but interesting. So if you look at the full sample, there's clearly a gradient between where people live and their prevalence of hypertension, and this is adjusted for age and gender. But if you look at blacks, pardo and whites, what you see is that blacks have the highest overall levels of hypertension, irrespective of segregation. But there's still this gradient of higher levels of hypertension in more segregated neighborhoods. And again, this is for blacks. We see this patterning for browns as well as for whites. For hypertension. And similarly, if you look at diabetes, again, we see this stark contrast based on where people live. So 25% prevalence in the highest segregated neighborhoods compared to 13% prevalence in the least segregated neighborhoods. And then for blacks, they have the overall, in blacks living in segregated neighborhoods, have 36%, have a prevalence of diabetes of 36%. And these numbers, interestingly enough, for blacks are higher even than whites in the most segregated neighborhoods, right? So we can think about all the intersecting and intervening pathways that might create the charts like this. So one is about where you live, but it's also about race and how those things intersect to influence health outcomes in this population. These are our models. You guys are familiar with multivariable models, right? And so our odds ratios, when we have the low segregation as our reference point, these are adjusted for just age and gender, race and study site. So a 55% increased risk of hypertension and an 86% increased risk for diabetes. When we adjust for socioeconomic status, which we think might be a potential confounder or driver, it's reduced, but not, it's attenuated, but not eliminated. So a 26% increased risk for hypertension and a 50% increased risk for diabetes based on where people live. So our main findings, just in summary, are that we found, not to our surprise, but that blacks and browns were more likely to live in segregated neighborhoods, environments. Prevalence rates showed this gradient of hypertension and diabetes based on where people live in the city. And we found this 26% increased risk of hypertension and a 50% increased risk of diabetes based on just where people live. So what are the key implications, and how do I kind of bring it back to these larger macro social determinants that I discussed prior? I think that residential segregation is crucial to understanding health, and it's an important structural determinant of cardiometabolic risk factors in urban areas in Brazil. And the systematic and disproportionate exposure of blacks and browns to economically segregated neighborhoods represents a form of structural racism that creates and perpetuates racial health inequalities in the country. And so if we're thinking about ways to mitigate health, and again, sociologists tend to think broad, but epidemiologists don't. And so as an epidemiologist, it's novel to think about the broader context and the broader social, economic, and political context in which health happens, and to think about these as targets of intervention as opposed to individuals as targets. So a lot of times when people think about health, they say, oh, you need to eat better food, or you need to do more physical activity, or you need to reduce your stress, right? That's what they say. But what this says, or what this implies, is that we need to think about context, and the context that drive these behaviors, the levels of stress that people experience, and understanding health out of context will make us the interventions and the policies we develop will be mismatched if we don't take context into consideration. So it's important to think about these things. So I started with this quote. The problem of the 20th century, but now I've changed it to the 21st century, is the problem of the color line. I think that's true for the United States, and I'm learning that I think that's true for Brazil too. And we have to wrestle with race and racism and the structures that create and perpetuate unequal environments for individuals. We have to wrestle with that if we're really going to address racial inequalities and social inequalities in health. Without doing so, we won't, really move the needle at all in terms of health and health inequalities. And so that is all I have in terms of my presentation. I'd like to acknowledge folks from the Dornsife School of Public Health, my mentor. We have an urban health collaborative that studies these things in various dimensions. My researchers at Fiocruz, Dora Chor, Simone Santos, Leticia Cardoso, Veronica, who was instrumental in helping us think about the sociology of space and race in Brazil, and other collaborators from the study. Without that, thank you so much for your time, your attention, and I'll take questions now.